I turned it off. It's down to 60. But around 24/7. Years older, better. Yeah, that's the nice one.
Nick, let me know when you're ready to go. Ooh, Sarah's here. Hey, Sarah.
I think you're good to go.
Can y'all hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yep.
All right. Hey, everybody. Sorry I couldn't be with you. I'm not feeling well this morning. So I'm proud to present Johnathan George. Johnathan is like me. He's a little bit older. He is an older student is what I mean. He's got his mechanical engineering degree from the University of Tennessee in 1993. So actually he graduated from college before I did, which is kind of crazy. But anyway, he worked in industry as a long time before he came to us as a mechanical engineer. He also ran a little business where he repaired microelectronics, did a few internships at cellular therapy labs. So he did some cell culture stuff, and he's very interested in creating new technologies to overcome difficult health challenges given his own experience, because Johnathan is a liver transplant patient. And what he's doing right now is investigating the effects of rocking on trunk control in children with spinal cord injuries as his dissertation project. And so that's what he's going to be presenting. But he wanted to say that regarding his previous work as a mechanical engineer, he designed off-road tires. So anybody that rides on a riding mower or an ATV or a tractor, there's a pretty good chance you're riding on Johnathan's tire design. So with that, I'll say welcome, Johnathan.
Thank you. Yeah, I bought a lawnmower and looked at the tires and said, yeah, I probably designed those things. So anyway, I did that for in a previous life, kind of, and then got interested in all the cool health technology. So I'm talking, I was going to say this morning, but I guess it's afternoon, about muscle activation patterns during rocking, and specifically in the context of children with spinal cord injuries rocking in a rocking chair. So I'm going to give a little bit of background about why we want to have kids in a rocking chair, tell what we're going to be, what this research is trying to answer, the questions we're trying to answer. Going to go over some methods, and then our results, specifically about what we see about the EMG levels, what happens to EMG levels during rocking, and sort of the timing of how that happens, muscle activation during rocking. So when we think about spinal cord injuries, typically one of the things that people think of is someone who maybe can't walk. They might be using a wheelchair, might be using other assistive things to help with, poor control of their hands. But the effects of spinal cord injury actually affect pretty much all the body systems. Breathing, bladder control, GI tract, skeletal system, everything is affected. And then there's also longitudinal outcomes that have effect over time. And that's even a bigger deal for kids because, of course, they're injured earlier in life, so they have to live with these problems for longer. And also, they're still growing when they have their spinal cord injuries. One of the things that we're going to be focusing on is head and trunk control, because that is critical, especially for these kids, and finding ways to help them with that is one of the things that the therapists at Fraser Rehab, who I've been working with, are focused on. So when you have a kid get a spinal cord injury, their skeleton, their skeletal system, their whole body is still growing, immature and still growing. And that can lead to things like scoliosis, and actually scoliosis can work with some of the other issues that you get with spinal cord injuries to cause things like pneumonia. So scoliosis, that's a curvature of the spine. And there's been studies on kids injured, I think, before the age of 13, I think. And in some of the studies, over 100% of the kids injured at that age end up with scoliosis. And it can be a big deal for them because it can compromise their respiratory function, which can lead to pneumonia. Pneumonia is actually one of the leading causes of death in this group. So it's really serious. It can also lead to pelvic obliquity, which can lead to pressure sores, which is another big problem for so at Fraser Rehab, they focus on a therapy method that they call activity-based therapy. And the idea of this sort of traditional therapies for spinal cord injury focus mostly on compensating for the injury. So you evaluate the patient, see what is affected, what deficits they have, and what they still have left, and they use the things they can do to try to compensate for the things that are injured. And then you might use devices to help them compensate also. And so, of course, the activity-based therapy, people realize that they're still going to have to compensate for the deficits these patients have, but they try to restore function as much as possible to these kids, and they do that by intensive activity. One of the mainstays is walking on a treadmill, and this activity generates sensory input that comes to the spinal cord from below the level of the injury, and so you can actually stimulate motor output. The spinal cord can respond to that sensory input and stimulate motor output. And they work to try to train the spinal cord to stimulate appropriate motor output. It's pretty cool that what they've been able to do with this, and they've shown that locomotor training specifically, where they have the kid walk on a treadmill, they give them body weight support since they can't support their own body, and they have therapists help them move their legs. And they have shown that this actually does increase current control significantly. So even though they may not be able to use their conscious mind to control these muscles, by doing this intervention, they can actually improve the response of these postural muscles to improve front control. So one of the issues they face is that since these kids don't regain full control of all their muscles, they need ways to allow them to go back home and in the community use the muscles that use this function that they've regained. It's not as easy as with a typically developing kid who can run and play. So one of the things that they thought of to do was to put these kids in a rocking chair. It's something that's relatively easy. It gives them some support, but also allows them to move in a way that these kids find very enjoyable because it's something that they often can't do on their own. So this video you're seeing here is a little rocking chair that they modified slightly to make it usable by this child. Unfortunately, it's not the safest thing for one of these kids. They can't catch themselves if they were to rock hard enough to fall over, which is definitely a possibility. So they asked us to make a safer rocking chair, which we did. So I've talked previously about the design and build of the rocking chair, so I won't go through that. But this is the rocking chair we ended up producing. So what we wanted to do with this, though, is to look at, okay, we know the kid can make the chair rock. They got to be using some muscles to make it rock, but there's lots of ways you can make a rocking chair rock. You can push with your legs, you can shift your weight by moving your trunk, you can use your arms to shift your weight. There's lots of things you can do. What muscles are these kids actually using when they rock in the rocking chair? We'd like to see it activating trunk muscles. Does it do that? Are any other muscles activated during rocking? We wanted to look at the timing of muscle activation for these different muscles during the rocking cycle. And we wanted to compare typically developing children, get a sort of an idea of what's normal, and then look at how that differs from how children with spinal cord injuries use their muscles. Do they all use them in the same muscle activation pattern? Are they different patterns? Is it just all over the place and no patterns at all? So we recruited 21 kids, 11 of them with spinal cord injuries, 10 typically developing kids between the ages of about 3 and 11. The kids with spinal cord injuries, we were interested in SATCO score, which you can see here. We ended up with a good wide range of SATCO scores between 0 and 19, which SATCO score is a measure of trunk control. I won't go through the technicalities of how they measure that, but it sort of measures what level you have trunk control at. So 0 is essentially no trunk control or head control at all. So the child with a 0 here, we had to have the halo on his head to hold his head up, just to be able to sit in the rocking chair without his head flopping. And then probably all the people in this room would test 20 because that's the highest that would be a level. So the only issue we had to sort of take what we could get. This is a population that's that is there's not just lots of subjects that you can test. So it would have been nice if we'd had some more lower SATCO scores. Almost all of them were between 11 and 19. So that's kind of a limitation of the study, but it also actually led to some interesting findings. So to get our data, we brought the kids in. We put EMG sensors on 12 different muscles, both sides of the body, so ultimately 24 data streams that we were recording. So we did for the trunk, we did the paraspinal muscles at 3 levels: cervical, thoracic, and lumbar. We did rectus abdominis and oblique also. Then for arms, we did biceps and triceps and pectorals. Legs, we did rectus femoris, hamstring, tibialis anterior, and the gastroc. In addition, so we recorded data first while they were just sitting quietly in the chair. That was to provide a baseline. One of the issues you get when you're doing EMG studies on kids or anybody with spinal cord injuries is that for any muscles that are affected, that are impaired, typically EMG is calibrated by doing a maximum contraction. You have them contract the muscle as hard as they can, then you look at all your readings as a percentage of that. But you can't do a maximum contraction if they're not able to voluntarily contract the muscle. So there's a lot of literature on how to deal with this. But a lot of it, the way they do it is you get a baseline and then you subtract that off of all of your subsequent readings. In this case, the readings during rocking. So we recorded data during quiet sitting and during rocking. We also recorded data from sensors. Now, some of these sensors are being used in another project, but the one we're using here is the position sensor. So we use that data to synchronize our EMG data with the actual physical rocking of the chair. I'm not going to go into detail about our data pre-processing because it was actually, it looks kind of simple here, but it was pretty complex. I got some help from Grant Morgan on this, and he can attest to the complexity of some of these things. But we had to pull the EMG data out into a format we could use in MATLAB. We had to synchronize our sensor data with the EMG data they were recorded on 2 separate systems. And then we had to separate the data into the different separate trials. So each child rocked in 5 different ways. And we had to separate that out and then take a moving window RMS of all that data. So before we get into the other things we're going to discuss, I'd like to define sort of how we talk about the rocking cycle. So this blue line is that's real data from the position sensor. We define the beginning and the end of the cycle are when the rocking chair is all the way to the front position, as far forward as it will go. And then down here is the back of the rocking cycle. So if you think about it as the points where the chair rocking reverses direction. So during this blue section here, the chair is moving backwards. It's all the way in the front and then all the way to the back. And then during this section, it's moving forwards. And then the dotted line here, it's at the center. It's at sort of the neutral position where it would be sitting if the child was just sitting still. And that's pretty typical of the motion you get. It's a pretty sinusoidal looking motion for all the participants. So one issue we ran into with this EMG data was that for a lot of the trunk muscles, we ended up with a cardiac artifact, where what you're seeing here is the left pectoral data, which of course sits right over the heart, and all these big spikes, that's all the heart beating. And so about half of our data is completely obscured by the heart beat. Now there's a number of methods that have been developed for dealing with this. There's filters you can put on. Some of the methods, you actually record an ECG signal while you record the EMG and try to use that to subtract off the cardiac input off of the EMG data. What I decided to do, partly because I, in my previous reading, had not realized this was going to be an issue, so I didn't record an ECG. So I wasn't able to do some of these things. I developed my own method that worked for the analyses that we were going to do. So basically what I did, I went and manually set a threshold. I could look at the data and see that the actual EMG data is down here. If I set a threshold there, I can write a MATLAB script that detects when we pass that threshold. I then set a little offset on each side of that window, and I just delete the data. That leaves me with about half of my data. So it doesn't look like there's much we could do with that, but when I interpolate between those points, I end up with a signal that if you were to kind of just mentally go in there and draw what you think goes on between there, you get something that looks like what we've got here. Now I can do two things with that. So one of the pieces of data I want out of this is average EMG. So yeah, I've got half of my data gone, but the average of what's left, as long as I don't average in the blanks, should be about the same as the average of the entire thing without the ECG contamination. So, and that's possible because the cardiac contamination isn't synced up with the rocking cycle. So it ends up, whereas the actual EMG data is synchronized with the rocking cycle. So we end up with a reasonable approximation of the mean value. I would also say that this data is the worst data we've got. Most of the data has a much smaller ECG because it's taken from other places on the trunk. And of course, the arm muscles, leg muscles don't have this issue at all. So once we've got those mean amplitude numbers calculated, we can look at what happens from the baseline, that quiet sitting before rocking and during rocking. So each of these represents one of the muscles that we looked at, and we're starting with the paraspinal muscles, and then let's see, and we've got the rectus abdominis, oblique, pectorals, biceps, triceps, rectus femoris, hamstring, tibialis anterior, and gastroc. And so each of these lines is one of the participants. This is the spinal cord injured participants. And so we see, you can kind of tell by looking that most of them increase, even in the legs. A lot of them, you see some of them are sitting down here flat and don't increase, but most of them do. So of course you can't necessarily draw a conclusion based on this, but it's a nice way of visualizing it. This is our statistics table for the same data. You'll notice the PSC NS8, several of the kids had problems with the cervical sensors, and we didn't get data on all of them. But we had a significant increase in muscle activation for all of the muscles. Now that doesn't mean that every single kid increased. It just means that it's a group that is statistically significant increase in muscle activation. So we can say, and actually we had similar results for the kids, the typically developing kids. So another way of visualizing that data was to look at a heat map. So the top row there is the typically developing data. That's just an average of all the typically developing kids' muscle activation for all these muscles. And you can see there that relative to the typically developing kids, there's less muscle activation in the leg muscles. And in general, as you go down the spinal cord, so the muscles whose nerve roots originate farther down the spinal cord are less active in the spinal cord injury group. And this is also sorted by SATCO score. So SATCO score of 19 up at the top, and then all the way down to 0 at the bottom. Now this kid was 0. he actually had acute flaccid myelitis, which is a different presentation. So he didn't exhibit that same pattern of lower activation as he moved down the spinal cord. He had actually pretty, he had pretty high activation for some of his leg muscles. So then going back to our typical rocking cycle, we wanted to know where in this rocking cycle it was typical for these kids to activate their muscles. So similar to what's done, this is some data from walking. And it's well known, like in the gait cycle, what muscles are active and when they are active in normal walking. And then there's a lot of studies done for different conditions or different, like this is, they're perturbing their walking. So they had a bunch of different perturbations, you know, where they push them or whatever and see how long it took them to recover. So we wanted to do something similar to this, where we could look at the rocking cycle and see if there were patterns in time as to where the muscles are activated. So to do this, this is an example, one of the kids, this is one of the typically developing kids. So on the top is our position data, and we can use that to see, to split this EMG data up into the different rocking cycles. So using MATLAB script, we just took and found each of these peaks and split this data up. So this is the same data, all split up and then overlaid on top of itself. So these are all those rocking cycles. And you can see there's a lot of noise in them, but they do all exhibit roughly the same pattern. There's a lot of variation in the amplitude of them also. They all exhibit the same general pattern. And when you take an average of all of them, this bold line here, the average of all those rocking cycles. So a lot of the noise kind of averages out, and you're left with what we would consider the typical muscle activation for that child, that one specific child. We then do that for all the kids, all the different muscles. And so this is, by the way, this is the cervical paraspinal muscles. So this is all the different typically developing kids. Some of them didn't use those muscles hardly at all. And here's the one that we just looked at. They had a really high activation, scaled differently than the previous graph. So it looks like a bigger amplitude, but we average all those together, and that gives us a sort of a prototype rocking cycle, sort of a typical, for the typically developing kids, that's the typical activation pattern. And again, some of the noise averages out. So when we do that with all the muscles, and then plot them, we end up with something like this, where we can see that we do get pretty good, well-defined activation patterns throughout the rocking cycle. With the typically developing kids, we have high activation in the tibialis, pretty good in the gastroc where they push on the footrest. It's interesting, if you think about the rocking cycle, right in this part of the rocking cycle, they're moving back forward. And what we found is when their feet are on the footrest, if they don't lift their toe, which is what the tibialis does, it actually will slow the rocking down. So lifting the toe right there is kind of an important part of rocking, just to keep the resistance really in your gastroc from slowing you down as you rock forward. So, and then here's the kids with spinal cord injuries. You can see that for many of the muscles, they do have a similar pattern. And we're gonna plot those next to each other in a minute here so we can compare them better. But one thing I'd like you to notice is the dotted lines here are the standard error of the mean. And for the kids, the typically developing kids, in most cases, this one has a pretty good error there, but in most cases, you've got your standard error is parallel to the line and is relatively close. So not too bad as far as variability in this data set. This data set, however, has much higher variability. And we're going to try to investigate why that is and what we're actually seeing there in a minute. So what we're really interested in more than the amplitude of the muscles analysis is the timing of when they're being activated. So we normalized these to the peak-to-peak amplitude of the rocking cycle. And that gives us something that looks like this. So when you scale them to the same scale like this, you end up with many of the muscles looking remarkably similar. So like cervical paraspinal, it's almost identical with the exception that it's a little bit offset. Similar for the thoracic paraspinal. Biceps is almost precisely the same. And then there's some that are like 180 degrees out of phase, like the oblique here is out of phase. You also see that for some of the, so the dotted line here is the typically developing, and the solid line is the spinal cord injury. You see some of these, you have this interesting double peak, where one of the peaks is offset and one is coinciding with the typically developing. And some of the variability and noise in these, and also the fact that some of them are showing a second peak that coincides with the typically developing, got us to wondering if we had like maybe more than one method of making the chair rock in the spinal cord injury group. The other thing that looking at some of these changes, it's possible to at least speculate on why some of these changes happen. So, for instance, when you think about these paraspinal muscles, this is as the chair is moving forward and then reversing direction. So if you think about it, this chair is moving forward and then turning around. If the child doesn't do something, their trunk is going to just want to keep going forward. And so they have to activate the muscles in their back to keep sitting upright. So that's the typically developing. For many of the kids with spinal cord injuries, they can't push with their legs very well. So their strategy to make the chair rock is to lean forward and then lean back. So they're actually using, the typically developing kids are responding to the rocking of the chair. They're using their muscles to stabilize their trunk. The spinal cord injury kids are using their muscles to make the chair rock. And I can't prove this, but it's my speculation would be that this peak is coming a little earlier because it is causing the chair to rock rather than responding to the motion of the chair. So to kind of get to the bottom of what's going on with the spinal cord injury group, we were pretty confident that our typically developing group, for the most part, was rocking all with pretty much the same muscle activation patterns. So we wanted to try doing some cluster analysis. So cluster analysis can get very complicated. There's a whole machine learning branch of it. But we used a relatively simple version. So the idea with cluster analysis is this isn't real rocking chair data. This is just some sample data to sort of explain the concept. So if you plot a bunch of points, each of these points is in 3-dimensional space, so it's defined by 3 pieces of data, basically. So you go in here and you calculate the distance from each data point to all of the other data points. Then you look at all of those distances and you take the smallest distance. So in this case, I think it's these 2 yellow dots up here. And say that's a cluster. Then you calculate the distance from this cluster. There's different methods. You can take the average of the 2. You can take the average distance from each of them. You can take the centroid of them. There's a number of them. But you calculate all those distances, and then once again, you look and see what the closest distance is and either add it to an existing cluster or start a new cluster. So in this case, I broke this into, I guess, 4 clusters. So the yellow is 1, the green is 1, and it looks like those greens are far away, but if you rotated that in 3D space, you'd see that they're actually closer than some of the ones that they look like they're closer to. This guy is in a cluster all by himself, and then all these blue ones are in another cluster. And if you look at this, this is called a dendrogram, and that is representative of what you're seeing here. So these those 2 yellow dots there, they're the first to cluster. And then the next one is over here, and I'm not sure which ones they are on here. But you can, if you want to look at, say, 3, well, I did 4 clusters here, so you can say, see, this one is the 1. You draw a line right here. See, 1, 2, 3, 4. So there's your yellow group of 3. There's your 1. And then I guess this one's that blue group, and this is the green group. Anyway, so to look at clusters of our data, we were interested in timing of muscle activation. So basically, we broke the rocking cycle into 4 segments, in 25% increments. So 25%, 26 to 50, 51 to 75, 76 to 100, and then we calculated the mean of the. I shouldn't normalize it. It's the muscle activation with the quiet sitting baseline subtracted off. We calculated the mean for each muscle in each of these segments, and then we performed cluster analysis. So you can't well represent that visually, because with 12 muscles, 4 data points for each, we have 48 pieces of data that we're using to cluster this. So it's in 48 space rather than 3-dimensional space. So you can't visualize it, how it scatters easily. But you can do a dendrogram. So we clustered it using that, and we got, we actually ended up with really 4 groups. This group clustered together with the typically developing kids. All the typically developing kids were in a pretty discrete cluster. Then there was a group of SCI kids who were not as similar as the typically developing, but they were similar to them. And then we had this cluster along with this one kid who clustered all by themselves. So I used some other methods to determine which cluster this guy should go into, and it was actually closer to this group than it was to this group. So just so we could have a cleaner analysis, we added it to that different cluster. So when we graph that out, those mean values that we used to cluster these. So the tan dashed line is the typically developing kids. What we see is that for most of the muscles, that cluster of the similar cluster that was more similar to the typically developing group is actually more similar, which is kind of what you'd expect. But it sort of, and the different cluster is quite a bit different in many cases. So like here you got this hammock shape where the high points are at the ends. And the similar SCI group has a relatively similar hammock shape where the other one is more of the high point is towards the middle of the rocking cycle. And again, this one shows the same pattern. This one shows the same pattern. That's all the paraspinals. This one is sort of inverse of that, where the typically developing, the high point is in the middle, similar with the similar group. The different cluster shows a hammock shape. As you move down the spinal cord again, to where the kids with spinal cord injuries have less control of their muscles, you get a little bit more varied results as far as, so like here's the tibialis, you have a pretty well-defined muscle activation pattern for the typically developing, but both of the SCI clusters show relatively similar to each other activation, but not as similar to the typically developing. So that's kind of where we're at with that analysis. We do feel like we can show that rocking chairs activate the neuromuscular system in these kids with at least this rocking chair that we made activates the muscles for these kids, and particularly the trunk muscles. For almost all of the kids, you saw good activation in trunk muscles. There were pretty consistent patterns of muscle activation and the timing of muscle activation for the typically developing kids. There was more variability in the children with spinal cord injuries. With, some of them rock pretty similar to the typically developing children, and others use their muscles in more divergent patterns, which is kind of to be expected because these kids have different kinds of impairments, and they're having to tailor their muscle activation to those patterns. We do think that the rocking chair does have potential for use along with activity-based therapy, so the children can rock in their home and use these muscles and practice the improvement in muscle activation that they've gotten through the activity-based therapy. I'd like to thank everyone who's helped me so far with the project, of course, especially Dr. Roussel, who's been my mentor. Dr. Behrman and her team at Fraser, Molly King helped a lot with collecting all the data, and Dr. Beatrice has been helping me with the statistics, and of course my dissertation committee, Dr. Roussel, Dr. Behrman again, the doctors Bertacci, and Dr. Casada. And I wanted to give a shout out to Grant Morgan again for his help with a lot of the MATLAB coding. And if there's any questions, I'd be happy to take those now. Yeah.
Could you go back to your slide with your participant demographic? In a couple of those,
There we go.
so I see that in the injury levels, some of them were not rated at injury level.
Yeah.
And even with the Asia grades, there are some NAs.
Yeah.
Is that because performing that Asia is a little bit harder?
So the Asia is not used below a certain age, as I understand it. This is what the therapists tell me. So that's why, and so the ones that don't show an injury level, those two have acute flaccid myelitis, which is not an injury level. It's more of a, I'm not sure if they figured out the cause of that. I think they think it's sort of a polio-like thing, but it affects muscles all over the body. It doesn't just affect one piece of the spinal cord. And then, like I say, Asia grade, of course, which means that you can't get an Asia grade for those two, the first and last, actually. And then the other three that have an ACE there were too young. I believe. Yeah, so that's it's there.
I've seen that we perform ASIAs like not just once but progressively as well, to see the progressive injury as well. Is that something that has been done?
So the Asia injury Asia grade that we're reporting here is the one that is evaluated closest to when we did the study. And I don't think I could get with Fraser and get the exact dates and everything. But so I don't know if I know they do SATCO, especially when they're doing studies. They just did a big study on SATCO a few years back that showed that SATCO increases significantly through the activity-based therapy. And so they do that, every once in a while. So they do sequential SATCO scores. Yeah.
To follow up on that, does the increasing SATCO scores actually correspond to any better quality of life outcomes or actual improvements aside from activity-based therapy?
So trying to remember that. So the study where they found the increase in SATCO scores, I don't believe they tried to evaluate functional gains. I mean, SATCO is kind of a functional test, so the idea with SATCO is they support the child at, so they'll start supporting them all the way up to the head. And then they remove support from the head. And if they can control their head, they get 1. If they can't, they're 0. And there's also grades as far as they can support it, but if you push it, they lose control and things like that. So, and you just move all the way down. And the level at which they are no longer able to support themselves, that's where the score is. So there is some, it does have some functional ramifications, just from the way they do the test. Yeah.
I have a question. So I see with the injury level, you've got a lot of thoracic injury primarily. And so I'm wondering if you've looked at difference between the thoracic injured group versus the cervical, or maybe that's something that you're going to look at in the future.
Yeah.
Because some of your EMG data, I'm wondering, some of those bimodal points and all, what's in there.
So I put together a table and looked at the different clusters, and I tried to see if there was any correspondence with SATCO score, injury level, age, and I could not find any patterns. So which kind of surprised me, to be honest.
Yeah.
That I couldn't. I mean, and I didn't present it here, but I've used 3 different methods to try to calculate clusters. One where I actually look at sort of max and min activation and see how far that is offset in the rocking cycle from typically developing. And that cluster is almost exactly the same way as the method that I showed here. And so I think it's pretty clear that there are real differences between these clusters and how they're doing their rocking. And I haven't had a chance yet, but I kind of like to go back through and redo that chart, but broken up by cluster and see what happens. This cluster stuff I've just been doing. It was something that was suggested to me like a couple weeks ago, and so I went back and redoing it.
Surely you don't have anything else to do. I mean, you're probably
there's so much more I could do. I think that's one of my fatal flaws is keep thinking of more analyses and more.
Yeah.
More
You got
things.
used to the writing.
Yes. Anyone else? Yeah.
Did you track any other positional data, like of the body, except for just the rocking motion, to potentially like try and figure out why these differences exist?
So like how the body moved. Maybe we should have. There was some suggestion of using motion tracking data. It's a little bit hard. So when a child is rocking in a rocking chair, a lot of their motion is dictated by the motion of the chair. So as long as their feet are on the footrest and their arms are on the armrest, the only thing that really moves independent of the chair is their trunk.
And the feet, because
Well, the feet can come off of the footrest, but for even like a kid who has no leg control at all, sometimes you have to like strap their feet down to the footrest. But as long as their feet are on the footrest, their legs are moving because of the way the chair is moving. Does that make sense? And so my thinking going into it was that we're not going to get a whole lot of data from motion tracking just because of that, the way that that's dictated. Now, maybe there is some stuff from the trunk because, you know,
especially those central sections.
spinals for the kids with spinal cord injury, especially the cervical and thoracic, to be some of the primary muscles they use, especially for the ones who had very little leg control. Some of the kids we tested had pretty good leg control, and they were pushing on the footrest just like the kids with developing kids. But the ones with little leg control, they use those paraspinals. There's one kid who basically he'd let gravity pull his head forward, and the chair would go forward, and then he'd pick his head up, and the chair would go back. You know, and that's what he did. And he was, which is one of the advantages of the rocking chair, is that even a very impaired child can make it rock. And the fact that, you know, for a lot of these kids who have very little leg control, we did see very small, but, you know, they're there, increases in activity. You know, part of the whole thing with activity-based therapy is training that spinal cord. And so, you know, like I say, the typically developing kids are using their trunk muscles for stabilization. And if you can trigger that same response, I'm sure they're not thinking about it. If you can trigger the kids with spinal cord injuries to have their spinal cord trigger those postural muscles to activate in response to that rocking, that's going to help them with their trunk control. So anyway, some of that's speculative at this point, but
That just made me think of one last thing is with respect to the children with impairment. So they were all recruited from children who are engaged in the activity-based therapy. Do you have any idea? I think you had on your one slide time since injury.
yeah,
But did you know how many weeks into ABT they were?
that's a good question. I hadn't thought of that. I ought to, you know, because yeah, most of these were actively engaged in
Yeah, like were
ABT
they
at
in the
time.
beginning of it?
Yeah,
Were they mid or were they?
The other
6 months
thing
in?
that I wish we'd had time to do, and you know, COVID majorly screwed up my data collection, because right when I was starting, COVID hit and they wouldn't let me bring kids in for the typically developing kids for over a year. I couldn't bring kids in. If I'd had time, it would have been nice to see if any of this changes with more practice at rocking, because a lot of these kids with spinal cord injuries, they'd never rocked in a rocking chair before. And so we had them in the rocking chair for 15 minutes. And most of the data we're using was towards the beginning of that 15 minutes. If they've had, you know, a few weeks rocking in the rocking chair for an hour a day, how would this stuff change? And I think it's likely that some of it would. So anyway. Yeah.
Did you consider any other like filtering techniques aside from the like any like frequency based
For the
ones?
cardiac?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
So I actually applied some of them and wasn't getting great results. You know, you know, you can, so like a lot of the, if you look at the raw EMG, the left pectoral muscle for a lot of these kids, you could see the ECG trace very clearly. And so I even worked with taking that, trying to isolate that, filtering out the EMG out of it, and getting the ECG trace, and then scaling it and inverting it and subtracting it from some of the other muscles and it was just, I couldn't get it to work well enough and you know, that's sort of one of the techniques they use, where they record the ECG with a regular ECG setup and then subtract off and there's a number of other techniques, and I tried 2 or 3 of, just filtering, you know, frequency based, and it reduces it a lot. But it was still to where I felt like I was going to be more accurate just to delete that data. And there's some other stuff that I didn't show here, where when I did that interpolation, I actually used some of the data from other rocking cycles. Since the rocking cycles tended to be the same, I used data from the other rocking cycles where, well, this rocking cycle doesn't have a heartbeat in this section. So I took all the rocking cycles that had good data at that point in the rocking cycle, averaged that, and used that to help me interpolate for that missing data. So I don't know that it's a perfect method, but I think it did a pretty good job for the analyses I was trying to do.
So Johnathan, as a summary, do you think the rocking chair stimulates trunk muscles or not?
Yeah. I mean, you know, whether it improves over time is something we don't know yet. But I mean, you could tell, for, like I say, for a lot of the kids, that they didn't have any leg control, and the only way they could rock was using their trunk muscles. You know, the EMG shows for sure that, you know, they were using trunk muscles to make the chair rock.
And so going forward, do you think you could use the chair to assess whether or not they're improving, like seeing that activity going forward? And I think you should also mention that we have an instrumented chair that we're trying to get rid of EMG, right? I mean,
yeah. So I guess I forgot to put that. No, I didn't do the future work slide. So it's actually more present work that I'm doing right now, but I'm finishing up right now. But we're using, I mentioned at the beginning that we had sensors on the chair, 4 sensors, and we had a strap, we had an accelerometer, and of course the position sensor. And we're using that data along with the EMG data that we've got to train machine learning algorithms to try and predict muscle activation. And I thought about adding that to the end of this presentation, but I figured I'd keep it focused. But we're actually getting quite good data. You know, as long as we have data from the child that we're predicting, we can predict future data quite accurately from that same child. So at this point, we can't generalize to kids who we've never had rock in the rocking chair before. But maybe with more data we could, or maybe we just always have to do a training session where we get EMG from that child, and then in the future we can train it. But it definitely, you know, we can definitely get an idea of what muscles they're using based on the sensor data.
So have you guys commercialized that chair?
Not at this point.
Not yet.
Working on.
Yeah, we have talked to the.
This is another example of something that the office, the tech transfer, passed on. They didn't want to proceed with the IP for some reason, but we're still going to try and push it through Dr. Harkema's company, Power Neuro Recovery.
Yeah. And if we can get the sensor prediction of muscle activation or detection of muscle activity working well, that would be an additional selling point. But I think even just a rocking chair that works well for kids with spinal cord injury.
Yeah, I would think
Would
there's
be-
a niche market out there
Yeah,
for at least
yeah.
for the.
And I know
chair to get
Dr.
into the
Behrman's a
house.
big promoter for this, and she talks to lots of people in the community. And I've talked to some of the other people, and they're like, "We need a rocking chair." So, you know, it does have some potential. What else? Oh yeah, we're out of time.
All right. Well, thanks, Jonathan. Thanks, Nick. Thanks,
Yeah.
Melanie.